Welcome to Milsurf Mike channel. This video can be considered a continuation of the Yingman video, link in the card, as I go over the history of the Hakim Rifle. There really isn't much information out there on the development of the Yingman and its developer Eric Eklund. Fortunately for this video, I was able to interview Miles Vining on some of the information he's obtained on the Hakim and Rasheed. He's pretty much the go-to when it comes to Middle Eastern and Central Asian firearms, so please check out some of the links to his content below. First, we need a little historical background leading up to the adoption of the Hakim. Egypt had been a semi-autonomous part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. The European powers would take interest in and leave Egypt after the Napoleonic era, creating a power vacuum filled by Muhammad Ali. He would become strong enough to nearly take control of the powerful Ottoman Empire, something the European powers wouldn't allow because they preferred an easily to manipulate sultan. They basically neutered the military complex that Ali and his grandson Ibrahim had built up, derailing the Egyptian economy to near bankruptcy. Their weak successors would be forced to borrow from European banks to run their economy. This became exacerbated by the building of the Suez Canal. Since they were unable to sell all the public shares, France convinced Egypt to buy the remaining shares, equaling 44%. Egypt would in turn sell these shares to Great Britain at a discount to pay toward their debts. Since the Suez Canal and the Red Sea were a major part of the trade routes to India, Britain would insert themselves into Egyptian politics, eventually making Egypt a protectorate. While not a colony, Britain would look upon Egypt with pith-helmet arrogance as a subject race. World War I would see the Ottomans join the Central Powers, while Egypt itself would remain officially neutral, although under Britain's protection due to the canal. The end of the war would see the death of the Ottoman Empire, and Egypt instated King Fayoud in 1922. The 20s and 30s would see an uneasy alliance between Fayoud and the Nationalist Party, the Wafd, who held most of the parliament's seats against British interests. These relations would soften in 1936 with the rise of the Italian threat, as Egypt would still need Britain's help. Fayoud would die, replaced by his son Farouk. Egypt would officially be neutral for most of the Second World War, but it was a major base for Great Britain. Some of the nationalists would be pro-Rommel and pro-Axis. Farouk wanted to install a pro-Italian advisor, but would see his reputation take a major blow on February 2, 1942, when the British surrounded his palace and forced him to recall a pro-British parliament. This was an unbearable humiliation for many in Egypt, especially for the nationalists. Officers such as General Naguib and a young lieutenant, Abdul Nasser, would dream of an independent Egyptian military. These two men formed the Free Officers, who would later be the backbone of the revolution. Egypt would officially join the Allies in 1945, so they'd have a seat at the UN. King Farouk was still the head of state and decided to join the Arab League. The Israeli War for Independence would embarrass the Arab League as well as King Farouk. Israel would field 60,000 well-trained soldiers versus what an Arab commander would later call soldiers that were only good for parade marches, although Naguib and Nasser both fought with distinction. After this embarrassment, Farouk would try to save face by finally getting rid of the yoke of the British. He called a nationalistic Wafd. Nationalists include Marxist, fascist youths, and the Muslim Brotherhood. They would sabotage supply lines to the British at the Suez Canal, to the point where the British needed 80,000 soldiers just to prevent sabotage. British reprisals would cause protests and mobs. The Free Officers took advantage of this unrest to pounce in July 1952, when the Free Officers would take over Alexandria and Cairo. Nasser insisted on only exiling the king instead of execution, a move that benefited him as Farouk's decadence and exile further discredited the monarchy. The Egyptian Republic would be proclaimed on June 18, 1953, and Nasser would consolidate power by pushing Naguib to the side and using the Muslim Brotherhood's penchant for violence as a motive to arrest them. Nasser didn't want to be beholden to either the West or the Soviet Union, seeing Israel as his main threat. He saw the scandal of the Levin affair, where Israel tried to fake Egyptian attacks against the British. In retaliation for these, quote, attacks, Israel attacked the Egyptian headquarters at Gaza. The attack again exposed Egyptian military weaknesses. Nasser would respond with Fedayeen attacks into Israel, as he knew Egypt was not ready for an all-out war. A bigger result of this culminated on September 27, 1955, where Egypt signed a huge arms deal with Czechoslovakia, where they obtained massive quantities of Czech arms and Soviet aircraft and tanks. Keep this deal in mind when we finally get to the story of the Hakim. Besides Britain and Israel, Nasser also drew the ire of France, who wrongly believed Egypt supported nationalism in Algeria, and the U.S. for recognizing China. The Western powers tried to bring Egypt within a sphere of influence by helping Egypt to secure a loan for building the Aswan Dam, increasing the arable land and providing a huge amount of electricity. The U.S. and Britain started to impose conditions that Nasser felt difficult, so the U.S. and Britain withdrew their portion of the loan. Nasser responded by nationalizing the Suez Canal Company. Britain, France, and Israel wanted to respond, but the U.S. refused to sign off on military coercion. Britain, France, and Israel agreed to attempt to take back the canal in what became the Suez Crisis. Basically, this tomfoolery would be a military defeat for Egypt against overwhelming forces, but a huge diplomatic victory for Nasser, as both the U.S. and Soviet Union would condemn Britain and France. The U.S. would compel Israel to withdraw and help clear the canal. British and French property was sequestered and their nationals expelled. The yoke of the British was finally gone. Now would be a good time to talk about the history of the Hakim Rifle, as this will help us further along in modern Egyptian history. Thanks to the Second World War, there was a huge stockpile of 8mm Mauser ammunition left in the country. King Farouk would adopt the Dieudonné design FN-49 in 8mm, although relatively few of these would be produced for Egypt, only around 38,000. If you want to learn more about the FN-49, please click the card above. Shortly after the revolution, Egypt saw a desire to have domestically produced semi-automatic rifles. Remember that they were trying to stay outside both the eastern and western spheres of influence. Sweden had just finished the updates to their AG-42 Yingmen rifles and were looking to replace it with an assault rifle by 1954. They were happy to sell the equipment and know-how to Egypt. Erich Eklund would help modify the Yingmen to not only shoot 8mm Mauser, but added a variable gas port so the rifle could be adjusted to whatever ammo was being put through it, since 7.92 by 57 ammo loads were all over the place. The new rifle would also have a deflector that made the brass eject forward, as well as a muzzle brake to help with the recoil. And all of these adjustments were very minor, and the manual of arms of this new rifle would be the same as the Yingmen. Alright, so this is very similar to the Yingmen rifle, which I demonstrated in that video. There will be a link above on that. But basically, the magazine goes in like so. And you pull your dust cover forward, pull it back, and it chambers the round. Now I got snap caps in here, so and it holds open. There's the safety back here. And you feed it via stripper clip like you do the Yingmen rifle. I don't have a good stripper clip to feed this, so I've just been feeding the magazine when I did my shooting demonstrations. So, back to the video. This new rifle would become known as the Hakim. Most Egyptian firearms would end up being named after places, such as the Port Said submachine gun, the Helwan pistol, the Suez RPP, and the Aswan SG-43. Most Wikipedia depth sources online will say that the Hakim is just a common name and that's where the rifle's name came from, but I learned from my conversation with Miles Vining that it's very likely named after Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Amir. Without going into too much depth, he and Nasser were friends in the early days, but would have a rivalry as Nasser became dictator. Amir was loved by the military, and there was definite jealousy on the part of Nasser. Think the dynamic between Stalin and Zhukov. Amir would die under mysterious circumstances after the debacle of the Six-Day War. The official line is he committed suicide, but his family insists that Nasser had him assassinated. There'd be around 70,000 Hakims produced, and one would assume these rifles have played a part in the various conflicts with Israel. In reality, this isn't the case. The number of rifles produced was nowhere near the number of soldiers. The serial number of Hakims in 1956 is around 2,000, so it's unlikely many saw use in the Suez Canal War. Remember the Czech arms deal I mentioned earlier? Most of what would be used by Egypt was likely came from this deal, such as VZ-52 rifles as well as Soviet aircraft and tanks. One might think that these made it into the Six-Day War, but again, very few pictures exist showing Egyptians carrying Hakims. Most small arms used in this conflict came from the Soviet Union, as Israel captured Type 2 and Type 3 AK-47s, and Egypt would only produce stamped AKMs later on. One should note that most of Egypt's frontline troops were actually in Yemen and not Egypt during this conflict, part of what led to their disaster against Israel. By the time of the Yom Kippur War, the Mahdi factory was cranking out AKMs. So if the Hakim wasn't used in these conflicts, where did they go? Egypt was embroiled in its own Vietnam War type conflict in Yemen, so many of these rifles would go there. Somalia would also become independent in 1960, and Nasser would send rifles to aid to bolster their fledgling defense force. Egypt would continue to supply Somalia with arms during their wars with Ethiopia. Ethiopian captures of these rifles would become an avenue for them being surplus to the United States later on. My Hakim. If you're on gun Instagram, I'm sure you follow an account called Surplus Arsenal. He is an unapologetic SKS homer who absolutely hates the Hakim. Although they have a reputation for being accurate, they also don't have that great of a reputation for reliability. Whether it's that from non-standardized ammo, or expecting direct impingement to work well in sandy environments. This, along with Soviet aid, would make the Hakim a short-lived rifle. I don't have too many complaints shooting it. It really throws the brass forward, but you also get to feel a nice wash of gas back in your face when you fire the rifle. You pray that your iPro is in good shape. I would definitely take the Yingmen with the 6.5 over the Hakim if you were to give me a choice. Still, this rifle fired well the few times I've taken it out, and was far more reliable than my FN-49. While it seems like a good enough rifle, you can see why Egypt relegated it to exports while using aid weaponry before they began producing their own version of the AKM. Please be aware where the groups who claim to represent you and your elected officials stand on the Second Amendment. Please join the GOA, the best no-compromise 2A organization out there, and get $5 off your membership with the link in the description. If you like this content, please check out my other videos, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also check out my Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and who has support on Utreon and Patreon. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a great day.